She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand, hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For Catacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Catacrow, Dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack.
All right. Hey, good evening, good night. It's just another episode of Anansi Web Education. Nancy Web Education, every episode, we try to remind you of the things happened in Guyana, the things that happened in Guyana. And it's not to just bring these things back to you so that you can feel bad. It's basically to remind you of what happens, and hopefully we can get to the road of recovery and to ensure that these things do not happen ever again. Mr. Granger, good night. How are you, sir?
Good evening. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I think you made a very pertinent comment there that we are thinking of the future and we want to create a better country for our children and grandchildren. So that's the purpose of Anansi Web Education, to not to blame anyone, but to ensure that the future is the future of our country is a place that you want your children to grow up in. And many of us, are old enough to have very fond memories. And when we hear the theme song, like Life in the Country, it's really full of nostalgia, and we wish we could go back there. But let us think about the future, and let us think about what we're going to discuss this evening. And it's about, our rights as human beings, as Guyanese citizens. So thanks for your welcome, and on to the show.
Oh, yep, on to the show. But before we do that, and let's thank all of our listeners, our viewers, whether they're in or outside of Guyana. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Since Mr. Granger mentioned the theme song, well, it's not a theme song, but we love to play it here. Life in the Country. I'm just going to play it back for another 30 seconds so that I can see your facial expression. I really want to see it again and let our listeners.
Catacrow, Dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country.
Yes.
Indeed, that tells the people about life in the country. Daga bark.
Cockacrow, Dagabak, Donkey, even
No,
Dr. Quack.
yeah, yeah. So you know it. You know the entire song. Hi, everyone. Good night again. Welcome to Anansi Web Education with former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, David Arthur Granger. Today's topic, it's about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was adopted by the United Nations in 1948, which, when you do the math, it's over 75 years ago. The responses in 2024 by Guyana's Minister of Governance, and you know that person's name, Gail Teixeira, in the People's Progressive Party administration to queries, in response to queries by the United Nations 140th session of Human Rights Committee in Geneva, Switzerland. However, her responses were, of course, as you all know by now, appalling. Today, the Anansi Web Education Program will examine the state of human rights in Guyana, and we will move to answer three questions. So listen keenly. Three questions. The first, Mr. Granger, the first question, sir, is what human rights violations were queried by the Human Rights Committee?
Mark, that is a pertinent question. It's a good place to start because human rights involve everything that makes us human. Our education, our employment, the environment, equality, everything that we are concerned about, food, freedom. So when you speak of human rights, you're speaking about the total experience of being a human being. And it doesn't matter if you're male or female. It doesn't matter if you're Indian, African, Chinese, Portuguese, Indian. It doesn't matter if you're tall or short. It doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or Hindu or Christian or none of the above. What matters is that you are a human being and that you have rights. So to start with this question about what human rights violations were queried, I would say that our viewers and listeners should go back to the reports that were published in the media, and of course with United Nations normally there's full disclosure, and you just go to the website and see what took place. But to summarize some of the queries about violations, I would say one is about anti-discrimination legislation. How effectively is it enforced in the country? Another is about ethnic divide. The assumption is that the researchers, and bear in mind, my friends, this committee is made up of high-level persons, authors of books, professors at universities who have written and studied and researched this issue. So it's not a press conference. This is serious research, and they have found that there's evidence of an ethnic divide. And I think those of us who live in Ghana know there is an ethnic divide. I'm not saying that it is antagonistic or not, but there is a divide. There's also evidence of violence against members of the LGBTQ community. And some people have not grown up and started to understand that the fact is that these persons who are members of that community are human beings and they have human rights, and they shouldn't be ridiculed, and they shouldn't be their rights shouldn't be violated. There's also the question of the police force, and if you look at your screen, you'd see how the police force, 3 members of the police force are effecting an arrest. Well, that is a violent violation of that person's human rights. Whatever offense he might have committed, there is a more humane way of arresting him, and that is a very bad example of policing in 2021. This is after the regime change in this country. There is also a concern about the prison service, in which the queries concerned overcrowding. And as you know, the 3 main prisons were built during the reign of Queen Victoria, when that was. So there were 3 main prisons at that time: the Berbice prison, because we had 3 counties at New Amsterdam, and then there was the Georgetown prison at Camp Street, and there was the Mazaruni, or the Essequibo prison in Mazaruni. Well, if you ever stepped into one of those prisons, some of them have been very badly damaged now, you would see that they are really archaic, and they're overcrowded, because some people have been incarcerated for very small, very minor misdemeanors. But anyhow, the Human Rights Committee queried the overcrowding, the lack of sunshine, lack of exercise, good food, and good management. Then there's a complaint about the frustration of the public because the accusations against the vice president were not investigated. And this came up now at the international level. This is not something you could brush away at the Freedom House press conference. This is an international issue that there has been no investigation by the police or by any agency into those accusations. There's also the question of equity. Everyone knows that in December 2019, I declared National Petroleum Day, which means that on that day, Guyana became a petroleum state. And people like to boast about, fastest growing economy. Well, it hasn't been trickling down to the poor people at the bottom. And the Human Rights Committee is concerned about equity in the distribution of this petroleum wealth. It's quite a legitimate question. They're also concerned about the judiciary. Guyana has not had a substantive chancellor of judiciary for over 17 years. And one member of the committee queried this, saying that if a person is kept acting, it means that, there is no confidence in that person, and that it's like the sword of Damocles hanging over her head. And there's a feeling that, her judgments could be biased. This is not true, but this is what the question. This one the question were asked. The idea is to confirm persons and express confidence in them, but Guyana has not been able to do that, even though this present administration has been in office for nearly 4 years. They're concerned about acting Chief Justice, acting Chancellor, even though the leader of the opposition has stated quite clearly and quite publicly that he is recommending that the incumbents be confirmed in the position. They're concerned about the environment. If you're living in Guyana, and I'm living in Guyana, especially along the coastline, even in the hinterland, I think in the majority of the 10 regions, the air is filled with smoke. That is to say that people are burning the stubble in the rice fields. People are burning to build housing schemes, and the smoke is just hanging in the air. I wouldn't be surprised if people eventually come down with respiratory diseases. Not only that, sometimes you can go into some rivers that used to be. When I was a young officer in the hinterland, you could scoop of water from the Kuyuni, and just drink it and bathe in it, and wash and use it for cooking. But you can't try that now because the environment is not being protected. And this is one of the questions the Human Rights Committee asked about, the protection of them. And there are agreements. There's something called the Escazú Agreement, in which the people need to be consulted and informed. And this is there's a query, there's a question about whether this agreement is being properly implemented. And there's a question about the GBA, the Guyana Broadcasting Authority. And the members of the Broadcasting Authority are not independent, they're not impartial. They are appointees of the government. And that's a big problem because the media should be free from political interference. And that is what. So these are some of the issues that were raised: the environmental issue, the issue of ethnic balance, the issue of equality, the issue of investigation of allegations. So it is wide ranging. And if you wish, you can just go through the papers and see that almost every aspect of human life has been inquired into by members of the Human Rights Committee. So I would say, in answer to your question, Mark, that especially in cases where they felt they had evidence that the rights of the citizens were violated, those issues were subject of question. I wouldn't say the question was hostile, but they wanted more information, and the Guyana representative wasn't able to provide that information. And in fact, in one case, the representative of Costa Rica, well, he didn't represent Costa Rica, Mr. Carazo, who was a native of Costa Rica, had to upbraid the Guyana representative of being confrontational. This is a review of Guyana's performance, and the person presenting Guyana's side is confrontational, and they made some very strong and strange remarks about Jacobinism. Well, if you don't know what a Jacobin is, you Google it. It is a sort of extreme behavior that was prevalent during the French Revolution in the 1700s. And then another high official described the questions as being, planted by the APNU. you know, Instead of paying attention to responding to the question and showing how Guyana could improve its performance, it became a brawl. It became a brawl in which, the persons presenting Guyana's case tried to pick a fight with the committee. Very embarrassing to right-thinking Guyanese. And I would say that those were the violations which were queried. And I think that they were correctly queried. And the answers, unfortunately, were lacking.
Answers were lacking indeed. You're on to Anansi Web Education. Alongside me is President David Arthur Granger. We'll move to the next question. And why has the PPP administration failed to uphold human rights? And again, we know that there have been hundreds upon hundreds of human rights violations, maybe thousands, under the PPPC administration. And so this is why this question is important. Why has the PPP administration failed to uphold human rights? Mr. Granger?
In brief, they have failed to uphold human rights because they feel that by upholding the rights of citizens would intrude on their control of the state. So they would use excessive force or allow the enforcement arms of the state to use force against citizens or against trade unions. And they feel that by sitting down with a union, which represents the teachers or nurses, is like a diminution of their power. Instead of saying these are unions which represent thousands of our citizens, let us treat them with respect. But they feel that every demand made by a nurse or by a public servant or a teacher is something to be resisted and resented. So PPP feels that their control of the state must be inviolate, that nobody must intrude in their control of the state. If you're in a village and there's a chairman of the Neighborhood Democratic Council, they feel they could barge in because they're the government. Instead of sitting and discussing the matters with the chairman, I'd like to see a picture in which the person, the minister who goes in, sits down side by side with the elected NDC. But the NDC chairman has to sit down somewhere in the audience. PPP feels that any sharing of responsibility for running any enterprise with somebody it deems to be a member of the opposition is going to diminish their own power and authority. Not true. We are now living in a modern age in which pictures are sent around this world in seconds. Facebook, the modern media, the social media. But in addition to that, we have to comply with and conform to modern regulations about human rights. Human rights concern the rights of all citizens. And it means that when a citizen's rights are breached, either by extrajudicial killing or by some form of deprivation, violence when he or she is in prison, or having to live in squalor, in poverty, or maybe living in the hinterland where the rivers are polluted by mercury or effluent from the mines or logging camps. They feel that anybody who criticizes their behavior, whether it's environmental protection, whether it's about empowerment, whether it's about elections, that criticism is normally rejected. And that is why, once the PPP got into office in August, 2020, one of the first things they did was shut down the Public Service Staff College. So, the first time in the history of this country, we had a public service staff college, and PPP shut it down. We had customs anti-narcotics unit, they shut it down. So what we find is that, narcotics are paying off the coast of Guyana again. We had a Department of Citizenship, which tried to control Venezuelan migration, they shut it down. So it is now, chaotic. So once the PPP is in office, it does not feel that it is constrained. It does not feel that it is required to conform to or comply with requests from civil society or even the national community, even though they signed on the dotted line. And my friends, believe me, these reviews are not, sudden. They are carefully planned. It's called a universal periodic review. And it means that the Guyana government knew 2 or 3 years in advance that the review was coming up, and they were simply caught flat-footed. They didn't do the research, but they failed to do to uphold human rights, and they tried to bluff their way through an international committee, but it didn't work. So I would say that they failed to uphold human rights mainly because they do not want to extend to the citizens of this country the human rights that those citizens are supposed to enjoy. Rights to education, rights to freedom, rights to equality, rights to empowerment, rights to avoiding ethnic discrimination, rights to protection against police violence. Um, you know, these are issues which the PPP feel belong to them because they are the government, and they would just come to your community and give you a black tank or a black plastic bag, and you should say, "Thank you, Mr. Minister." Yes, Mr. Minister. No, Mr. Minister. But when people demand, free flowing fresh water, when they demand stable electricity, when they demand, cheap food on a daily basis, these are things that are criticized, and they go back to the black tanks and the black plastic bags. So once the PPP feels that any demand from a union or a community is going to intrude in their governmental authority, they'll block it. And this picture you see here is very intimidatory. And it's meant to send a message. It is meant to send a message that when you commit a misdemeanor, you are likely or you're susceptible to that type of treatment. And that is the message that the PPP wants to send. When people protest peacefully, you find that policemen turn out with helmets and shields and guns and so on. That's how they ended up killing people in Linden in July 2012. So we have a problem in our hands. In our villages, in our streets, in our communities, in our trade unions, the PPP does not consider, first of all, the human rights of those protesters, the human rights of those citizens. That is what I'd like to say.
All right. This takes us to our next and final question for tonight. How does, this is an important one again too, how does the PPP administration's attitude to human rights violations affect ordinary citizens?
Well, this follows from the previous two questions. And I would say that in general, the PPP administration attitude is dismissive. And they feel that let's move on, you see a citizen being kicked and dragged. This is something that we saw frequently during the troubles between 2002 2010. Citizens' rights were violated, and they feel that people will forget, and they'll go into the same communities with the black tanks and the black bags as if nothing happened. So the attitude is dismissive. The attitude to the entire civil society is dismissive. Attitude to trade unions is dismissive. That these things don't matter. They're the government. And what are you going to do? You want to have another election? We'll win again. That type of thing. Every Thursday you hear about this boastful behavior about how they plan to win in 2025. So the PPP's attitude is that human rights against minorities really do not matter. And if these matters are reported and researched, well, then they will go to these committees in United Nations, in Geneva, and simply, sometimes make statements which are at variance with the truth. Statements like there's no ethnic, there is an ethnic divide. Explain how you're going to deal with the ethnic divide. There is an environmental problem. Right now, half of the country, is suffering from fires because of failure to maintain proper environmental stewardship. And it just goes on. Every one of the points, you get allegations against the vice president. There's no police investigation. And then you get stupid remarks like, all of these questions were from the APNU playbook. So the attitude to civil society, attitude to the opposition, attitude to running this country along, modern, humane lines is generally dismissive because they feel that that they are entitled to be in government and that they can do what they like as long as their supporters do not turn against them. I would say that the violations are manifold, and these violations were examined and brought to light by those four courageous members of the committee, Mr. Carazo from Costa Rica, Mr. Helfer from the United States, Mr. Rougeau from France, and Mr. Pais. And they have shown more courage. I could use a stronger word, but they have shown more courage in bringing these matters to public and international attention that many persons in Guyana, civil society, have not shown. Sometimes once they speak out, they're intimidated, they're shouted down. And the attitude of the PPP administration to the media. At one case, media operatives had to walk out of a so-called press conference. And it's intimidation, it's bullying, it's, victimization. And, you need to wonder if rather than democracy, we're starting to drift towards autocracy, in which the human rights, the civil rights of ordinary citizens are being not only trampled on, but also being ignored. The way you could go into a village and destroy people's houses, their books, their food, their sleeping accommodation. These matters could be resolved without the resort of violence, but they don't care. They go back in the same village with the black tanks and the black plastic bags and the hampers, and they feel that all is forgotten. And it isn't so. The country is gradually becoming not only autocratic, but also despotic. That, many people feel they don't have a voice. And if you are in some organizations, particularly state organizations like nursing profession or the security forces, and you speak out, or even the media, you are likely to be intimidated, you're likely to be treated with some disrespect or disdain. I think people are just keeping quiet. People are just remaining silent rather than speaking out. And that's why I'm grateful to those four members of the Human Rights Committee for speaking out, because they have done what a lot of Guyanese are afraid to do, to criticize the PPP administration abuse and violation of human rights.
Well said. David Otto Granger, former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, and this episode of Anansi Web Education. Speaking of all the crimes and the human rights violations and the PPP running and criticizing even the UN human rights members of that committee, members of the Human Rights Committee, for all sorts of different things, dodging the questions, silly responses from the PPP, of course, and the recommendations about investigation of racial discrimination by the PPPC regime in Guyana and crimes that were not investigated. Now, suddenly, and I just throw this as a bonus, suddenly we read that the guy who sits there as the VP of Guyana, um, Bara Jagdeo, says that he now wants an investigation. Is that like what? Superficial? Your take?
Well, at least he remembers what he said at the funeral for his head of the presidential secretariat, that those secrets will go to the grave. Um, I, I think in every major case in which there was a massacre at Bartica, he said he knew who did it. He knew who did the massacre at Luzignan. He knew who did the massacre at Lindo Creek. But when we tried to get to the bottom, AP, and we tried to get to the bottom of the massacres, we convened a commission of inquiry, but they didn't come forward with this knowledge that they had about, about Luzignan and Lindo Creek and Bartica and elsewhere. So I don't know why how suddenly, he's going to have this investigation, because when we hit a wall at Lindo Creek, a very senior police officer says there's no evidence because all the witnesses have been killed. That is what brought the Lindo Creek investigation to halt. Nobody on the PPP side was prepared to come out, and many of the witnesses had been killed. And that was a deliberate policy. So even if an attempt is made to convene a commission of inquiry, it is likely to fail, because the people who know or people who are involved either are still alive and they will not give evidence, or the people who know and are likely to have spoken the truth have been killed. So I am not really impressed with that move after nearly 2 decades that we've discussed this matter on Anansi Web and public interest, and it is simply a knee-jerk reaction to what came up at the Human Rights Committee, and that, oh, you want an investigation? We'll give you an investigation. And I don't think it's going to serve the purpose of giving truth, giving comfort to the families, because as that senior police officer said, all of the witnesses to these massacres and murders have been killed. And the people who were perhaps in administrative positions are unlikely to speak out for fear of intimidation. So let's see where it goes, but I am not persuaded that this is a sincere effort to solve the problem of criminal violence in Guyana.
All right, well said. I think majority of Guyanese are on the same page with you on that. It's just not going to solve. It's just basically a smoke screen, so to speak. All right, Mr. Granger, thank you so much for your time tonight. As always, we appreciate your time that is well spent answering these questions. And tonight we dealt with 3 questions. What human rights violations were queried by the Human Rights Committee? That's the United Nations Human Rights Committee. And why has the PPP administration failed to uphold human rights? And the final question dealt with tonight: how does the PPP administration's attitude to human rights violations affect ordinary citizens? And we see all of these things happen. This was police violently demolished villagers' homes in Mocha, Arcadia, and this wasn't in 1923 or 1723. This was in 2023. And take a look at police brutality. This was in 2021. And take a look at how police were treating protesters, peaceful protesters, all under the PPPC's administration. We know how they treat nurses or public servants. We know how they treat teachers. They have absolutely no regards or respect for public servants. They have absolutely no regards for citizens in general. I'm so glad, though, Mr. Granger, that throughout this half hour or so program, we didn't see you get any sort of blackout over there. The rampant blackouts upon blackouts every single day. Even the blackouts they're blaming on the NC, the APNU administration. All the blackouts they're blaming on you guys.
It's called UPS, uninterrupted power supply.
These folks. Anyways, we know better. GPL was managed better, far more effective under the APNU AFC administration. So the blame game again, unnecessary. Thank you so much for your time, though. Give my regards to your wife, Mistress Granger, and send us some pictures of that kitchen garden. I want to see some pictures.
I'll deal with I'll have a special program on food security at the household level.
Thank you. And we want to see you in that garden.
Good night to your listeners and viewers.
Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it. As always.
Oh, they are back now, me now I come home. Inaga, jackass, yeah, I fetch you load. Cockle shy hand, bag over shoulder, running by his side, a Rexy and rope.